we see that food remains a very critical issue to over 50% of the population. So that tells you the story is not just about poor people, but this is about everybody else.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. On June 27th, a group of food security experts from the United Nations and major international relief agencies released the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or IPC, that revealed devastating new data on hunger in Sudan. Their data shows that over 755,000 people are experiencing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. This is when there are almost no coping mechanisms left and people are starving to death. And this is not localized to just one part of the country. Those experiencing this extreme level of food insecurity are spread throughout several regions. The cause of this devastation is conflict. In April last year, a full-scale civil war erupted between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The food system in the country, including farmlands and trading routes, have been destroyed. Meanwhile, international humanitarian relief is being obstructed by the warring parties and not reaching people in need, at least in sufficient number. My guest today, Dr. Oliver Kiptu-Kirui, is Research Fellow with the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. He recently conducted a large wartime household survey of food security in every region of Sudan. We discuss his findings in detail, as well as what can be done to reverse the massive food crisis gripping the country. The war does not look like it will end anytime soon. So, in the midst of conflict, what can be done, if anything, to limit deaths from starvation and widespread hunger? Today's episode is part of our ongoing coverage of the crisis in Sudan, which is frankly starting to get some attention by more mainstream media outlets. We've, of course, been on this story since well before the outbreak of full-scale civil war last year. But I'm glad that other major outlets are starting to tune into the scale of this crisis. I just sort of wish they did so sooner. And as always, you can support our work by getting a paid subscription via globaldispatches.org. Every subscription we sell to you goes a very, very long way in helping us keep up this kind of coverage. Thank you. You'll also get, with a subscription, full access to our new podcast about the United Nations, To Save Us from Hell. Again, visit globaldispatches.org to support our work. Thank you. Now here is Dr. Oliver Kiptu-Kirui from the International Food Policy Research Institute. I'd just love, if possible, to have you share a couple of anecdotes about like food prices based on your, own experiences with friends, contacts, colleagues. So, would you just be able to kick off with an anecdote that you could share that just kind of demonstrates the rising cost of food in Sudan, maybe among your friends and colleagues?
Since the outbreak of the war in mid-April, food prices and access, particularly in Khartoum and of course in the other hotspots areas, have significantly worsened. If you look at the prices today, talking with different people on the ground and active engagement with many rural and urban households, we see that there is a lot of disruptions of agricultural production and the food prices are skyrocketing. So when we look at the end of 2023, by December 2023, the inflation already had surged to 300%. And of course, the food prices, which is a key for key commodities, had increased already by about 100%. That is in comparison to the pre-conflict levels. So in fact, today when we speak with our friends, and we still have colleagues and families in Sudan, food prices today are at about 350%, or 3.5 times the usual average over the last 5 years.
And I have to imagine, I mean, that puts, albeit a smaller middle class that exists in Sudan, that makes food security a dire concern for them, not just very poor people.
Yes, we see that food remains a very critical issue to over 50% of the population. So that tells you the story is not just about poor people, but this is about everybody else. Typically in the harvest season, we anticipate that food prices would be better now, food access would be better now, but critically, over 50% of the population now, 18, 20 million people, are really suffering and facing acute hunger during this harvest season.
Before we discuss just the scale, the scope, what's driving this food crisis in Sudan today, could you just sketch broadly what the food security situation looked like prior to the outbreak of civil war in April 2023?
Right before the conflict, already the food security situation was deteriorating in the country. If you remember the uprising that happened 2 years prior to the conflict, you will see that the main cause was, of course, the increase in bread prices. So this is basically the very basic commodity that many households would consume. So, I mean, the uprising and the hosting of the former president was basically because of the rise in food prices.
Yeah, I mean, it is worth emphasizing that the ouster of the, nearly 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir was predicated to a large degree on popular discontent over the rising price of food in general and bread in particular.
Exactly.
That's like an important point to make.
Omar al-Bashir was ousted basically because the food prices and generally the economic situation was already deteriorating. Basically, the bread prices had really skyrocketed, and it was not possible for many households to be able to purchase it again. So the picture before the conflict was that already the situation was not very good. Then the conflict is coming in, exacerbating, adding more burden to already a community or a society that was already facing skyrocketing food prices.
So you conducted a major survey on food security throughout Sudan, conducted in the midst of this conflict. And your findings have been used widely to demonstrate just the dire urgency of the food crisis today. I'm interested in just having you explain first, how did you conduct your survey and what were you seeking to learn? And then we'll discuss your conclusions.
So during the conflict, you may know that sometimes it's quite impossible to conduct the face-to-face interviews to collect data in the conventional manner. So what we've done is to conduct surveys and also key informant interviews in a more innovative way. So what we've adopted as the mainly computer-based, the computer-assisted telephone interviews, and we've also conducted, web-based conversations with different sectors in the country. So we've concluded surveys with 7,500 households, so 4,500 in the rural areas, and 3,000 that is just concluding now. We are just about 95% complete of the urban households. So we've been able to reach these ones. We are also in the middle of rolling out interviews with medium, small, and micro enterprises, 1,500 of those across the country. Again, we are employing these innovative approaches, and we've also done studies using satellite imagery just to be able to understand the ongoings in the country. So the focus of our work basically is really to look at the implications of the conflict on, say, incomes, on food security, on market access, and many other things, migration and social assistance and so forth.
And what did you find? And I do know that the findings obviously vary throughout the country, but could you just identify some of the top level trends and findings that you uncovered through this really comprehensive, this very large survey?
Thank you, Mark. I think the most critical thing that we really wanted to, first of all, find is what is the current situation on food security in the country. So we look at food security in several components. First of all is in terms of food consumption. Then we look at food insecurity experience. This is basically a scale based on responses and experience of different people. Then we also look at the hunger scale, household hunger scale. And then we try to look again at the coping mechanisms. What are the coping strategies that the households are employing? So the key story that we really wanted to follow was what is the status of food security in the country? So when you look at food consumption, predominantly you see that many households are consuming cereals and oils, consuming less frequently nutrient-rich foods like the meat, the fruits, and also the vegetables. And when you look at it in terms of the numbers, nearly 45% of the rural households are consuming inadequate diets. And we're just about to analyze the urban household data, but our preliminary analysis are showing not any better results.
Really? So it's nearly as bad in urban areas than it is in rural areas in terms of nutrient food options. That's
Exactly.
unique, I would imagine. That's not usually the case, right?
Yeah, we would anticipate that the rural areas perhaps would be better off, especially given that this is the agricultural communities. But we saw there were many other factors that influence the production. For example, there was the conflict disrupted agricultural activities. So many people were not able to access inputs to produce. At the same time, there was massive movement of people. If you look at Khartoum, along the irrigation schemes in Jazeera and so forth, these are areas that we anticipate that the rural areas in these regions would be better off, but the destruction of agricultural infrastructure and lack of access to particularly input seeds and fertilizers and tools meant that also rural areas were not spared in this process. And of course, if you look at the urban households, of course, the purchasing power was also grossly diminished because, of course, most urban households don't produce, but they are able to have the purchasing power to purchase whatever different commodities or food groups they would want to purchase. But of course, in the middle of this conflict, we've seen that incomes and sources of livelihoods have totally been disrupted.
We've seen obviously food security decline in conjunction with conflict. This happens often in the context of conflict. But what your findings suggest to me is that like the food system itself of like a major agricultural country and hotspot like Sudan has been like a victim of this conflict.
Yeah, I think Sudan is quite a unique case in many ways. First of all, most of the agricultural trading and in terms of input access and so forth would be traded through Khartoum. So the major trade routes in terms of input access generally would pass through Khartoum. And when the conflict happened in Sudan, and Khartoum being the epicenter of the conflict, most of the production along Khartoum and also the input access, also the market and the transport, and I would say the routes, the trading routes were majorly disrupted. So the entire country was basically affected. We've seen, of course, many farmers trying to produce using locally available seeds and so forth, but that productivity is very low. And that means a lot when it comes to how much food that can be produced that could be available in the long run. There were a few harvests, of course. There were some locations that harvested maybe sorghum and other commodities. But as you remember, and you may have seen, the militia groups or the RSF and so forth also disrupted transportation and movement of goods and movement of people. So some of the people may have had commodities, but they were not able to sell, and they were not even able to transport to where it was really needed.
With like the food system in Sudan in such precarious state right now, what did your survey reveal about how people are coping and how they're able to access whatever limited kind of food there is available at such a high price?
This was one of the most interesting findings that we also saw, that many households are actually, and of course, by this, when I mean this, many households, I mean rural households, because at this stage we had only analyzed the rural households mainly. So, out of the 4,500 households that we surveyed, majority of those households are actually employing what we call reduced coping strategies or strategies or mechanisms. This is basically employing strategies such as buying less preferred food because this is what they can afford, or limiting the sizes or the portions of meals that they are consuming. We've also seen households also selling productive or disposing productive assets and reducing expenditures on important productive inputs and so forth, so that they are able to meet their daily meals. In analyzing the food insecurity experience, we see that most households are also, skipping meals. Most adults are skipping meals, both male and female, or going a full day without food in order to cope with the reduced availability of food or reduced ability to access or to purchase food.
So I think the reason that the food crisis in Sudan is top of mind to many people around the world today is just the sheer size of it. Sudan is not only a very geographically large country, it also has a really large population. I think it's like a pre war population of over 46 million people. And you said earlier that now 50% of this population are in really dire food security crisis. How close do you suspect we are right now to many millions of people crossing that threshold into famine? And how bad and how immense of a challenge would this be if indeed that famine threshold is met?
This is a very significant question, Mark. And I think this is what is in the minds of many people that are concerned with Sudan. We've seen lots of efforts to address this. But again, in terms of numbers, we've seen that some states are really much affected. Also, the states that are in active conflict have the highest prevalences of either poor diets or in dire need of food support and assistance. These are states in West Kordofan, South Kordofan, and all the Darfur states, not if you talk of East and also West Darfur states. Of course, Khartoum is not left out in this. So, of the 18 or so million people that are actually in an acute food insecurity, so they're already in, these are people in what we classify as class 3, and this is in crisis. But there are a few million people, close to 7 million people, that are moving into category 4 already. If you see at even more advanced analysis that we have been done just recently after our report came out, so close to 5 or so million people, I expect, if nothing happens now, I expect it to fall into famine category. So the experience is really very significant. And in particular states that I've mentioned, the Kordofan states and the Darfur states and part of the Khartoum.
And so, if 5 million people indeed do fall into that highest level of food insecurity, the famine emergency, it's called the class 5 classification, how does that compare to previous famines in the last several decades that the world has experienced?
So first of all, Sudan now, this case in Sudan is one of the only cases that we are talking about of massive displacement of people. This is the global leading displacement of any humans in the current world today. So 9 million people displaced from their homes, 7 internally, 2 million people fleeing their country to the neighboring states. And of course, many people in the camps are the people that, of course, are in the middle of this crisis we are talking about. They are the people in this crisis. I don't think, even when you compare to what is happening in Ukraine or in other parts of the world, that such magnitude or gravity of this nature has been experienced in many parts. If you look at Sudan previously, of course, Sudan has also been in episodes of conflicts before. If you remember in the Darfur regions, the conflict that lasted for many years as well. This was not the scale. This was also regional conflict. But now this is a conflict that has engulfed the entire country with many regions, as you see, and the hotspots being all over the country. And of course, this has been moving right from Khartoum, then towards the south, and then finally to the west. And this has been moving. The targets have been moving, as so to say. So this is the biggest crisis that Sudan has faced when it comes to famine situation in decades.
So this is all, of course, a consequence of the conflict that erupted in April 2023, of which the food system throughout the country was a victim. The problem is that there is no real way out of this conflict as I see it right now. The conflict, the parties are intent on fighting each other. There's no real peace process to speak of. It looks to me like this conflict is going to grind on for quite a long time to come. So, in the absence of any sort of ceasefire or political settlement, what can be done to avert like some of the worst case scenarios that your study suggests in terms of famine and just dire levels of food insecurity? Is this really mostly a matter of getting more food and humanitarian aid into the country at this point?
We hope and we really beseech the warring parties to go back to the negotiating table and really hammer out, an agreement and return the country back to peace. I mean, many Sudanese share with me or share this opinion or this part of what I'm talking about, that we hope that this conflict can come to an end immediately, immediate ceasefire, But at some points that come to mind in what could be done in the interim as we hope these negotiations continue, the first one is that humanitarian assistance has played a critical role in providing food to people. I hope that immediate humanitarian aid could be scaled up to reach many people. So the most affected populations, especially in remote areas and also in conflict-prone areas, should really be scaled out and scaled up. We also hope that in terms of humanitarian assistance, there should be some coordination between the international agencies. There are also a few local communities and local units that are working in the country. So the national NGOs, the international NGOs, for efficient distribution of food aid, I think there should be lots of coordination and speaking together and working together. The second aspect that I think should be done is really supporting production. So if we restore agricultural activities, and this could be done by providing farmers with the necessary inputs, particularly the seeds that they need, the tools, the machinery that they need to resume cultivation. Because if there is local production of food and we address the transportation and translocation of these different material food products, that would be able to support and help. We should think about rebuilding the critical infrastructure, particularly Sudan being an arid and a desert country. Irrigation plays a significant role. So the destroyed infrastructure irrigation system should really be rebuilt. And this would support agricultural productivity and ensuring that there is enough food in the country. Local production should really be supported. The third point is protection and security measures of people. So we need to ensure that the humanitarian workers, but also the aid convoys, are able to reach the affected areas, because sometimes food has been procured from different sources, but there has been a lot of either blockades on the road, or even looting of the warehouses of humanitarian organizations that are supposed to reach these people that have been affected.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of having followed this from the United Nations, side of things, there is just profound frustration about the fact that it's extremely difficult. There are both security obstacles and also like bureaucratic obstacles that the warring parties have erected that are preventing sufficient amounts of humanitarian aid from reaching populations in need. And I just sort of wonder if all of what you just described, like rebuilding irrigation ditches and agricultural systems, can be done in the context of a conflict. It seems like it needs to be done because this conflict is not ending anytime soon. So in order to avert a famine, just something needs to give.
You're right. I think the dependency on humanitarian assistance or aid is causing many families also, I mean, there are many people who are able to work in their farms. There are people who are able to produce food. There are people who want and wish to be able to go to their farms and be able to produce and so forth. So if we are able to support these farmers and support local production of food, this would be helpful. And also the humanitarian organization could also procure locally and support the production systems in the country. So somehow we need to find solutions and ways of talking to the warring parties to allow the rebuilding of infrastructure that would produce food locally and be able to feed local population.
Well, Oliver, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.